Okay. Kia ora koutou, katoa. Did you know in the last decade, ARJC referrals have declined by a half? What does this mean for society? There's two broad things this has done. Firstly, it has meant that victims have less of a voice in the criminal justice system. Secondly, the offender has become alienated from their communities. So what do we propose to do about this? We want to do two things. We want to increase the referrals to ARJC, and we also want to change police perceptions of restorative justice conferencing. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to introduce the team. First of all, there's me, Rohan, then there's Daniel, then there's Trish, and then there's Jesse. And together, we are busting biases. So, we would like to first consider what are the actual barriers to referral. There are four of them. The first is that there's not much understanding of the therapeutic benefits of ARJC, or why that's even important. Secondly, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what cases are actually suitable to be referred to adult justice restorative conferencing. In particular, most police officers don't know the difference between ARJC and mediation and believe there must be a pre-existing relationship between the offender and the victim. Additionally, police and the public view it as a soft-on-crime option. And finally, many referrers think that it's just time wasting and that the process is too long. So why do we focus on police in particular? Well, the main reason is that 86% of referrals come from police. The majority come from police prosecutors. In addition, the first port of call that many victims and offenders have with the criminal justice system is the arresting officer. In particular, the arresting officer is the one who usually talks with the victim about restorative justice. So why is this important? If the officer has negative perceptions of restorative justice, that is likely to flow on to the victim, and they will also either want a retributory outcome or will not want to engage in the process. Additionally, if it is believed to be futile by legal aid and duty solicitors, it's not going to be adopted or referred by those people. And lastly, the public view police as the most trusted people in the criminal justice system, and if they have negative perceptions of ARJC, that will flow on to the public. Now I'd like to pass on to Daniel, who will talk about how we can change those perceptions.
Cool. So as Rohan mentioned, societal views on how we define justice have largely mitigated the success of ARJC. And we believe this flows down from the behaviours and perceptions of police, both operational and prosecutors. Therefore, our strategy needs to not only define, but also account for the three largest views on justice. If we look at the views, we've done this through the medium of a system-wide screensaver on police computers, laptops and tablets. These screensavers will be affixed to lock screens and resting modes and provide snippets of information of particular importance to the person of interest. So if we look at our first one, we have the Redeemer. So as you can see, we've used 92% of victims thought that their ARJC outcome was fair. And this is important because the Redeemer is focused on the ability of ARJC to repair broken relationships and reintegrate offenders into the community. So if we move on, we have the Punisher. So in this one, we look at the likelihood of offenders paying restitution to the victims in the ARJC process. And this is important because the Punisher believes that offenders should receive retribution for what they have done, often as a means of fairness. And then lastly, we have the Preventer. So the Preventer, we looked at the likelihood of reoffending amongst ARJC participants, and this is important to them because they care about reduced recidivism and the reintegration of offenders into communities. Cool. So if we look at the benefits of screensavers, so firstly, we expect to see an increased amount in referrals from police prosecutors. So the reason for this is that we have primed them to consider it, and we've also framed it in the way that they understand the benefits. We also see flow-on effects to defence lawyers, because if they see that police prosecutors are considering ARJC, then they have a higher chance of being accepted with their proposal, and so we expect more from them. Further, it is low cost and micro in nature, but easily scalable. So what this means is we've used existing hardware and systems, which means that this nudge is frictionless and cheap. And then lastly, we expect to see an increase in the amount of pre-charge referrals. This is because our screensavers also look at operational officers. And so the reason for doing this is because this is the point where we've seen it minimizes trauma the most and maximizes cost and time efficiency. So now if we look at why do we see these benefits? So firstly, screensavers recognize and work within previously formed conceptions of justice. So how we've done our screensavers is we haven't tried to challenge their core beliefs, but just give them an alternative view of ARJC. And then further, we've looked to prime them through consistent and frequent use of the screensavers. Every time they log in, they see it. And it is also benefits from having first attribution for the police with their computers. So moving on.
So Daniel has gone over our first nudge, which has addressed awareness of ARJC and attitudes to it. But the next thing we need to do is address some of those common misconceptions that police have. So one of them that Rohan mentioned earlier is that police don't realise that you don't need to know the other person in order to be referred. So what we recommend is having quizzes on the police intranet which address these common misconceptions. So what we have is a simplified scenario which limits what the police are going to focus on in the scenario and encourages them to consider the key issue at hand. We then get them to check yes or no, which triggers their system 2 thinking. So if they check yes, that's incorrect. So we get immediate feedback that the decision is wrong and why. The benefits of going on the internet is that it's educating police about what they think about referral may not necessarily be correct. Currently, if police are believing things like you need to know the victim or there needs to be a conflict and they have to be mediated, we might be referring only a very small subset of people to referrals when we actually have a much larger group that would otherwise be eligible. Similar to the screensavers, this is also a very low-cost initiative, and it also presents ARJC as a valid and actually widely available alternative to the retributive criminal justice system. So in order to see these benefits, we want to have this pinned to the top of the internet page. This will ensure that whenever police go on the internet, it's the very first thing we see. We also want it in the form of a quiz, because a quiz is a novel and fun way to present information. It's better than giving them an infographic or a poster which requires them to actually read it. It's also encouraging them to actively engage and think about the choices that they're making. With that, I'll now pass over to Jessie, who's going to discuss implementation of screensavers.
Thank you, Trish. So for the first 6 months, we'll pilot the screensavers with a sample of police stations to test its effectiveness at increasing referrals compared to the control group. So I'll now speak to several theoretical underpinnings supporting our strategies. So police will see the screensavers frequently, tapping into the mere exposure effect and tailoring slogans to match each archetype's existing beliefs utilises confirmation bias to our advantage. So to implement the screensaver and intranet quiz, QPS will need to invest in graphic design, IT and web development, all of which will be at a minimal cost compared to the savings from increased referrals that flow on to an increase in completed conferences that flow on to reduced recidivism. Thank you.